This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, and now you can rate the podcast on Spotify. We made it to 2022. I remember the feeling of intense optimism at the beginning of 2021, and we are in the midst of the Omicron surge. So any of that enthusiasm is slightly tempered, but I do have some goals for the year for the podcast. I'm actually very interested in being on other podcasts. So if you happen to have your own podcast and would like to hear me talk about secular grace or humanism, reach out to me. A second goal for the year that I've been thinking about lately is to be slightly more palatable for the Christian. My guest today is Webb, and I think he does an incredibly good job of being a bridge between evangelical Christians and deconstruction. Even the title of the podcast has atheist in it is probably going to frighten away most believers, but one of the goals for this year is to at least engage a bit more, not in a debate style, but as always in an honesty contest. If you are a believer and you would like to be on the podcast and talk with me, I'll be very open to that prospect. Please get in touch with me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Special thanks to Mike T for the first round of editing for today. I also did a bit of editing and the mix in with Derek's music. On to today's show. My guest today is Webb. Virtually all of my listeners will probably already know who Derek is, but Derek was the lead singer for Caedmon's Call for about 10 years, which was a very successful Christian rock band. And then he went on a solo career, and during that time, he went through his own deconstruction process. What Derek has done that is pretty amazing is be really open, vulnerable, and honest about that process with his audience, not only in his music, but also online and in various other media. Derek is the perfect guest for this show because almost all of his work is about being brutally self-honest, about an honesty contest, about vulnerability, about transparency, showing the world where he's currently at and not hiding any of that. It was the Truman Show episode that Jimmy and Colin were on, where Colin shared a story about seeing Caedmon's Call when he was 18. A friend of Derek's heard that episode, mentioned it to Derek, and Derek reached out to me. I'm very thankful that Derek reached out to me, and I think this is a great conversation. In preparation for this, both Jimmy and Colin suggested a number of things for me to listen to. Obviously, much of Derek's music from Fingers Crossed and Targets and various other albums. But the one that had the most impact on me was his podcast, The Airing of Grief, which I highly recommend, and there will be links in the show notes. Derek's current project is called The Jesus Hypothesis, and if you become one of Derek's Patreon supporters, you can actually be a part of that process. Derek will go into detail about that. You can find all of his music and all of his projects at derekwebb.com. I'll have those links in the show notes. Here is my conversation with Webb. Webb, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Great to be here with you.
Hey, I really appreciate you actually reached out to me after hearing an episode where a really good friend of mine, Colin, talked about what a moment it was for him. He was actually at a Caedmon's Call concert, and you guys were doing a cover of a secular song, and he had this context moment of like, oh, wait, music is just powerful just by itself. And he literally told himself now, Colin today, said, if I'd only known that the lead singer would someday be post-evangelical or whatever term you want to use,
Yeah.
and have a huge audience for that what that would have done for him as an 18-year-old kid. So,
Mm.
so thank you so much, Derek, for being willing to come on the show.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you responding and being open to it. I mean, as we were talking just a few minutes ago, like I really care about the space. I really care about my friends who are still in the evangelical world. I care a lot about my friends who are kind of journeying all on the outskirts and in no man's land around it. And it's as you know, and I'm sure your listeners know, it's like it's not a thing that you detach your care. You don't stop caring about it, and because
Right.
it's still so much about where I've come from, and it's so much of the language that's so familiar to me, and so much of our lives and families and colleagues and coworkers and everybody they're all on on the spectrum somewhere with some experience of invisible reality and some opinions about it.
Right.
And so you don't stop thinking about it. And so it's funny. It's one of those things it's really hard to kind of get away from ultimately. You can detach your belief system from it, but you still have an awareness of it. And I still have a care for it. And so I always, whenever I find people who are doing good work and holding intentional space for people to think about this, I immediately, want to listen. I want to contribute. I want to be part of it,
That's
so
awesome.
when I saw what you were doing, what you're up to, and what great conversations it seemed like you were having, I just immediately reached out, and I'm so glad you responded. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're definitely, the whole podcast, I think, was started to just say, you're not alone. You're not
That's
crazy.
exactly right.
Like
Yeah.
there's
Yep.
plenty of us who have gone through this, and
Yeah.
you don't have to go through it alone.
Yeah. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. One more piece of context that I think is important is that due to age and when I became a Christian, when I stopped being a Christian, and style, I actually wasn't familiar with your music very much prior to actually getting in contact with you. But what I am a huge fan of, Derek, is your work in this space, in this deconstruction space. So Colin gave me a list, and Jimmy too, both the people that were on that episode gave me a list of things to go listen to. And I absolutely adored. I listened to the first season of The Airing of Grief.
Yes.
And man, what a powerful piece of work that is.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Well, it sounds very much like what you're talking about. I mean, it was one of those, once some friends and I determined that like, oh, we're going through it. We felt like once we started to process our way through and out of a lot of kind of evangelical mindset, and just once we started, you think that what you're going through, everybody's going through. And you think that when you discover something, everyone just discovered it. And actually that's not true. It's most things you're coming into a moment with, and you're kind of suddenly in the stream with it. But there was, just like you're saying, we were realizing how many people felt as though they were doing it by themselves and alone and isolated. And because the church is so good at congregating and about congregating themselves around ideas and about things. And so once you're detached from that, there's just the lack of congregation. And that is and you suddenly feel as though it's like all the files in your computer still being there, but all the directories being gone. Like you can't find your way to anybody or anything or any. And so you feel like you're all alone. And that was the main reason that we wanted to do that, because we thought, because I had just put out this fingers crossed record, which was my kind of document of deconstruction that I had just gone through. And when people were responding to it, they seemed not to be responding to it so much as they were using it as an opportunity to do the same thing I was doing on the record, which is to tell their stories of what they had been through and where they had landed. And we thought, man, there clearly just needs to be more space for this, more safe space for people to be welcomed to tell and bring their stories, for the benefit of all the folks who don't feel brave enough to come or strong enough or maybe ready to come and bring and tell their stories, just in order that everybody knows that they're not alone doing it. So I really resonate exactly. That was our exact same motivation for doing it.
Yeah, I always say that's the magic, right? Is somebody's telling their story, and the listener goes, "You're telling my story."
Yeah, you hear your story come out of somebody else's mouth, and that's so deeply comforting. Yeah,
Absolutely. I do want to come back to more of your work, and we'll focus on that in a little bit. But I'd really like to hear your story. So the way that my guest often we begin with is like, what was your faith tradition growing up? What was that like?
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in the American South my whole life. I've always lived in the South. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. I lived in Texas for a while and am now back in Tennessee in Nashville and have been for about 20 years. And so anybody who knows what that is shorthand for knows that I grew up with, immersed in the language of evangelical Christianity. At least that was my experience. I actually, as I'm saying it, I realize that's obviously not everyone's experience, but that was an inevitability in everywhere I grew up. Was there was a presumption of at least an understanding of evangelical Christian faith, if not a full practice. So, and I grew up going to church. My mom grew up Baptist. My dad grew up Catholic.
Okay.
And so they raised me and my brother Methodist because I feel like they thought that was maybe the compromise or whatever.
Yes, I got it.
So as they both moved to the middle, they found the middle points for both in United Methodism apparently. So anyway, that's how I grew up. I was confirmed at 13 in the Methodist Church. We weren't super involved. My parents were not real religious, but they did feel as though, like a lot of parents, especially who were having kids in the late 60s and 70s, felt it was important to bring their kids up in church and to at least show up on a Sunday. And I was in the part of Memphis where we lived, the really good school, the school that I wound up going to was a private Christian school connected to the church where we went. So,
okay.
So 0 to 6th grade, I was in a private school at a United Methodist Church in Memphis, which is where we also attended. So, I mean, I was there, 7 days a week.
Right. Right.
I mean, I really was, because I went to school there too. And,
Yeah.
Grew up going to chapel at least a few times a week, if not more. And also walking through the sanctuary to get around to most of the other parts of the school, so really, really, really into that. And it was mostly for me, I think, well, you don't know how you're experiencing it when you're that age and you're coming up with it that way, because it's just part of the inevitable framework. It's just part of the context you're in, and you don't know your life without it. Even if it means nothing to you from a spiritual discernment standpoint, this is just all part of what it is and what we're doing. And
it's the water you swim in.
It is the water you're swimming in. That's exactly right. And until you get out of it for a second, you have no idea you're even in water. It's like the oxygen you're in. And so that's kind of how I grew up. And as I mentioned, I got confirmed, as you do, when I was 13 into the church, and they give you a Bible. And I don't remember if they kind of declare you're kind of a full member of the congregation in church at that point. I don't know what that got me really. I remember being baptized at that time. And then when I was in high school, by that time I was in Houston, and a lot of friends, the Baptists, especially the Southern Baptists, are really strategic in the way that what they do is they put a lot of their money and intention into youth programs, because they know that that's how you get families. Mm-hmm. And so, why evangelize one at a time when you can evangelize a junior high kid and get 6? Because you're going to wind up with all their siblings and their parents. And so that's a smart strategy. And so there's just the most kick-ass youth programs you can ever imagine going on in the suburb of Houston where I was. And so I was getting pulled into a lot of Baptist churches. I remember like, wow, what's going on with every other weekend, my friends are dragging me into some Baptist church for some cool, and it's a legitimately pretty cool thing, I guess, good pizza. And anyway, so there wasn't anything that really seemed to take root for me until the middle of high school, when I wound up involved with a high school parachurch organization called Young Life.
Oh, yeah.
Not church affiliated. Yeah. And that was real big at my high school. They're a high school parachurch organization. So, or at least at that time, they were mostly just high school. And Young Life, at least in my area, did a really good job of every one of these organizations or institutions have strategies. They all have strategies. They all have an approach. And Young Life's, at least in my area, it was to kind of go after the cool kids. Because if you get the trendsetters and the tastemakers, you're going to get all the rest, because they want to be like those kids. But the particular Young Life leader in Southwest Houston was also this really quirky, nerdy, kind of intellectual guy. And he was nothing like the cool kids that he was recruiting, so to speak. But and so I really personally resonated with him and connected with him because I was kind of a quirkier. I was none of those things. I mean, I was not popular or athletic or performed academically or anything like that.
Okay.
But I really resonated with his mind and how his mind worked. And he was really super smart and fascinating and funny. And so anyways, I got kind of pulled into that deal. And that was kind of the first point where I felt like it was something I was really choosing. And that was where I think I would have said I had an experience at a Young Life summer camp. And their properties are magical. Honestly, they're like, they are like the Disney level of detailed intention in all of their camps. They're really amazing. I mean, they do just a great job. It's so much fun. It's such a fun deal. And it's like, and every bit of it is combed over and intentional. And I love that about it actually. And so wound up between my sophomore and junior year. Is that right? I wound up at a Young Life camp, and I had heard this pitch many times. I mean, it's like I was so familiar with it, just the whole, like the 4 spiritual laws, like, okay, here's how the world works. Here's what got broken. Here's what was done about it. And here's your choice. You know, it was like, here's the deal. And I knew it super well. And I probably felt at that time like it was something I'd already kind of taken a position on, even passively, because I knew I had been baptized and gone through my little classes or whatever in Methodist church when I was younger. But they take you through and they kind of set you up, and it's like, and having worked with Young Life in a few years after that, you definitely get you get a pretty good view of how the sausage is made in terms of the intention around, like, okay, it's gonna be this message and then this one and then this one, and we're gonna leave them with that one until the next night where we're going to offer this one. And it's like, it's good communication. It's well thought out, and to be perfectly frank, I had chased a girl there. It's probably the reason that I was willing to go to that camp in the first place. And, you see everybody making the decision, you see the hands going up, you see the people going to the front. And I was like, you know what? I think I don't know, like I'm going to, for whatever reason, I mean, as I really try to think back to the experience that I had, it was one of those, okay, we're going to let them sit with, but here's what happened. And here's where you lost connection to God. And here's why it happened. And they kind of leave you with that weight and that heaviness until the whole next night. And the next night they say, but something was done about it. And here's what you do. And here's the opportunity to come and choose and decide and whatever it is. And then they kind of send you out into the beautiful hills of Colorado to think about that and then come back, and then we're going to see who made a decision. And they said, whatever, the one thing though is you don't go back to your cabins. We don't want you going back to your cabins. Just go out and find a space under the stars. So of course I was such a contrary kid. I was such a disciplined case all through all those years. That of course I went straight back to my cabin and hid. So they had counselors coming to make sure there weren't kids hanging out in cabins. And they came in, didn't see me, and left. But I went back and decided, I think I'm going to go ahead and own a decision about this. I don't know that I made it, anything happened. It was just like, I think it's time. I'm pretty down with this. I like these people. I like this thing. I kind of feel like I belong here a little bit. It was giving me some things I really needed at that time. I didn't have really a lot of friends. I'd been into music since I was single digits, but I'd been in a lot of bands all through high school and stuff. But I was in between bands right then. And that's like the story I'm kind of leaving out. It's not really super relevant, but the band that I'd been in for a lot of years, that was a big part of my identity, had ended right before that summer. And it was a big thing for me personally. Music is a big part of Young Life because they do these Young Life clubs every like Monday night during the school year. And they have guys up in the front strumming acoustic guitars, and they immediately wanted me to come and do that because it's smart, it's good. And they find a way to give you kind of a job to do that makes that kind of goes to your strengths. And that certainly did for me. And it was fun. Like suddenly I had a place to play music again. That was part of my identity again. I liked that. Friends and a whole, like, it's just like, here's like just the whole package just on a platter. You just kind of come and be part of it. And then you just get to all the benefits of it. It's amazing. And so I was like, I liked it. So I was like, I think I'm going to hang with this. And so I think I'm going to go ahead and give. It's funny. I felt like I was kind of giving. It was something I was giving them. I was like, I want to show up as a number for these folks because I like this thing. And this guy's done a pretty good job, and he's a good speaker. And I mean, he didn't tell me anything I hadn't heard, and it wasn't especially moving even. It was just, I was like, I'm going to go up there because I think that would make them feel awesome. Like like I want them to know that what they're doing matters. And so I'm going to show, and so I'm going to, say that that's where my flag goes in the ground, even though it'd probably been years before if that happened at all. And so that was my experience, came back, and I was really into that. So the rest of so I had 2 whole years plus summers to, off at camps and stuff to really, for that to really take root. And that was a really important thing. It was a lot of friends and a lot of memories and a lot of, trips out to Colorado and ski trips and all kinds of stuff after that. And even for a hot minute, considered maybe even working with Young Life and kind of being one of these Young Life leader guys. And it just looked fun. It looked like a cool thing. You had to have a college degree, any degree in anything to do it. And I knew I wouldn't ever have that because I barely got out of high school. I didn't have any interest in that. And because music was my life. I started playing guitar when I was like 7 or 8 years old, and it's the only thing I've ever really been good at. And it was my whole life. So I blew school off constantly to rehearse, to practice, and then eventually in bands. And that was my whole life. And so I knew I wasn't going to be going to college.
Okay.
But anyway, so I hung with Young Life for a while, even that first summer after my senior year. And I thought, but where it kind of turns is, so what would have been my freshman year of college, just after that, is when I met and connected with the folks who we started Caedmon's Call together. So Caedmon's was the band that I was in for about 10 years, right out of high school. So met those people, and that's its own story too, but met those people, and we started playing music together, and we all had a pretty quick sense that this had potential. There was really something here. We were really on to something. And in a very Malcolm Gladwellian kind of sense, we had a lot of advantages that just other bands weren't having around that time. And to where we were able to record our music and sell our music, and we were able to tour a little bit. We were in Texas. So there's a bajillion colleges, and so just a lot of things fell our way, made it really easy. And we found a lot of success at that. Wound up signed to Warner Brothers, and suddenly that was a 10-year career. And what was interesting, it was just 2 years previous that I had this experience that really, as I look back, I'm also kind of a closet intellectual, so I was loving and really falling in love with the academic side of all of this, and I realized how much my brain loved the jigsaw puzzling of systematic theology.
Oof. You're telling my story, Derek.
Yeah. So I really responded to that. And I think what I really had mostly during my more mature, I would say, years of belief was kind of a love affair with the language and a love affair with the structure and with the theology and with making it all make sense and being able to have answers and being able to kind of figure out some of that stuff. I loved it and loved debating it and loved, honestly, I'm framing it in such a positive light. What I should say is I loved like weaponizing it. That's I really, because I probably had some kind of a chip on my shoulder coming out of an experience where I was never seen as smart at all. And I think I just wasn't smart in a way that was being in any way noticed or measured by any of the schools that I was going to or anything like that.
I think we can safely say that's true.
well, but you know what I mean? And so I think I had this kind of insecurity, deep insecurity about my intellect. And so I was kind of coming out of my shell a little bit from an intellectual standpoint, and really loving how my mind really wrapped itself around all of the systematic theology side. And I was really studying all that, studying the history and I loved the idea of knowing a little more about that than the average Christian. I really, and I would start to infuse that in the songs I was writing, and had a vehicle to do that. Because by that time we were practically professional Christians, because we wound up on a Christian imprint label of Warner Brothers, and then wound up actually skipping to a different record label. The point being that, we were suddenly generating, Christian media. We were generating the influential Christian content or something. Although we didn't really know what we were doing or talking about. We would just and that's kind of what you learn is like the people who have those voices, they're not necessarily the people who know anything or know anything more than you do. They're just the people that for whatever reason have been given the opportunity to speak loudly, and volume is not an indicator of anything.
Yeah.
And so anyways, wound up for 10 good years writing songs. I was half of the songwriting for Caedmon's.
Okay.
But then there's also the added weird layer and pressure of being, as I said, kind of a professional Christian at that point and representing something about that. And there's some rules that wind up getting kind of applied to it in terms of what you can and can't write songs about and things like that. So
I can imagine.
That all winds up interesting. And again, I'm wired so contrary that I wind up really going for most of the things that you're not supposed to be writing stuff about. And that's what differentiates, I think, eventually my songwriting in the band. And then around the beginning of around 2000 or so is when I went out on my own as a solo artist.
Okay.
And did see myself as something of a disruptor, I think, at least in the space of what was typically being produced and covered from a subject matter standpoint of Christian art or whatever. It's a small space, but I was willing to kind of self-sabotage to take on some of the issues I thought the church didn't want to talk about, or things that I would see as, so I mean, that's really the things that I went after because I'm wired that way. Yeah. At least my early solo career, I made a career out of really gnawing on the hand that fed me during all those years. And
interesting. Yeah.
So I think during a lot of those years, I think folks who were paying attention or listening to the music seemed to have some suspicion that I was against the church or that I was out to criticize the church, when really I didn't see that at all. I was ultimately in my own crosshairs. And I mean, you write about what you know. And what I knew was my own heart and the way that I felt and looked at the world and saw that sort of thing. And so that's ultimately what I was writing about. But I did try to broaden it out for the benefit of folks who I thought, maybe needed to be shaken up a little bit like I did. But I only mentioned that to say that later, when I did go through, a legitimate deconstruction, deconversion, whatever you want to call it, there were people who said, see, we always knew, because way back then he was so critical of the church and this and that we knew that he must be on some road to ruin or something. I was like, actually, like, I was writing about the church because I loved it so much, because I really wanted to see it thrive and prosper and succeed or whatever at its mission. But then eventually, I guess it would have been around 2015-ish, went through some bumps kind of in my personal life, went through a divorce, and just had a moment to kind of take inventory a little, to do an audit of all of the presumptions that I had had for many years, many of which went all the way back to those early years, of being a new Christian in high school and then being in Caedmon's and some of that, and loving the theology and all that stuff. It gave me an opportunity anyway. Great failure will do this. And it's one of the great things about failure is it gives you the opportunity to kind of do an audit of the presumptions that you have about invisible reality and about invisible, unknowable things, invisible like God, unknowable like the future, to really think more critically about those things. And are they providing me a particular comfort right now, as I'm not just practicing? Now it's showtime. Like, now I'm really needing them to show up and either be meaningful and comforting, either the ideas or the actual expression of the ideas, which is going to be the body, the church, the people. How's it all gonna shake out now that the rubber's hitting the road? And it turns out that I'm not just a hypothetical sinner, I'm an actual one.
Interesting.
Because the church loves when you talk about, the church loves the idea of radical confession and really confessing your sins one to the other, and to really be open about that and get gritty, and really, they love that in the hypothetical. But when you start doing it in the literal is when they start getting panicked. Yeah. And when they start backing away and eventually communicating. I mean, it's like they really want you doing it, but then they want you doing it on their terms, and they want you doing it in a way that no one possibly could in a moment of crisis, because you're not collected and you're trying to survive. So you can't help the way it may come out of you at any given time. And that's interestingly the point where the church really leaves a lot of folks,
Yeah.
which is so fascinating to me, because it's like, well, isn't this what we've been practicing for
Right.
though? Isn't this what we've all been rehearsing for this moment?
Yes.
And now that I'm going to come to you with more than just the idea that I'm a sinner, but I'm going to come to you with like, oh, I actually am. And there's no escaping it anymore. And this is the moment, like you would think that this would be the thing we've all been waiting for. And this is the thing we're built for. And now we're ready to really, drop me into the machine and the machine does its thing. And it's like I was a wrench in the gears in the thing. And it's like, it had to spit me right out. And it's like ironically, you stop making sense to the congregation when you start doing the one thing that apparently is the thing that everyone supposedly has in common there. It's like going to an AA meeting and getting kicked out when they find out that you're actually a drinker.
Yeah.
It's like, I thought that's why we were all here. I thought that was the only one thing we had in common and the reason we were gathering. So why are you shocked? I mean, and I was writing songs even about, like, one of my best known songs during my early solo career was a song called Wedding Dress. And the chorus of it is, I'm a whore, I do confess. And I put you on like a wedding dress and run down the aisle. It's, I'm a prodigal with no way home. And I put you on like a ring of gold and run down the aisle. It's like, it wasn't false advertising. I wasn't making that up.
Yes.
I mean, I was trying to tell you, like you just weren't listening or didn't believe me, or what was it? And so it was around that time and that big audit that I mentioned is when I just didn't find any of those things particularly comforting or even really necessary, and really needed, when I was really needed to survive. And as I was going through, the hardest things I've gone through in my life, and really needing a framework to be able to look at it and have it make sense. And I needed something beneath me to catch me. And I needed something to lean my weight around on. And all the things that I had brought with me, they just turned out not to be real things. I would lean my weight over and just fall right to the floor. It wasn't a real thing. It wasn't really there. And so I immediately, what I had spent 35 or 40 years constructing and tweaking and working on like a Harley, as it turns out, was not a real thing. And I needed to, build a quick parachute during the free fall. And that kind of became the lighting the fuse on kind of where I am now, and trying to make my way into like, okay, well, what is real then? Or what can I discern as, what can I find? What can I test and find in terms of the way the world works and what's really going on? And it was such a gift to be split up from this language that I was so committed to and had worked so hard on for so many years, because you realize how much of it makes no sense and how much of it is just kind of some weird code language that you're speaking with a small group of people, many of whom are not really taking it out for a spin to find out what it's really made of. It's like the same way that you can't really get a clear sense of the quality of the boat you're in while you're in it. Because you are in every way incentivized to believe that it can hold your weight and that it is equal to the waves you're going to hit. It's not till you're thrown from the boat and you can get a out of body, vantage point of it. And you can say, oh my God, like that's what I've been in. Like that's barely a 2x4. How in the world, or you come down and put your feet down and realize that you don't need a boat because the water's 2 feet deep or whatever it is. Right. It's like, whatever it is, those moments can be a great gift. And then as you start to pull that thread, you just realize, oh, the whole thing just comes apart. For me, the whole thing really just came apart. And it was so good because there were so many things. It's so interesting. I swear to God, I'm going to stop soon so you can talk too.
Good.
You start to realize that there are so many things that you associate with this view of the world that you deep down, you knew didn't make sense. It's like when my friends from other religions or faiths, or my friends who seem to have lifestyles that were in contention with my view of the world, my Muslim friends, my general secularist friends, my agnostic friends, or my gay friends, they would come and we would talk about whatever the dilemma was. And I remember many times saying, and I think this is common, I wish it was like that. I wish I could tell you that your way is an okay way, and that you can get to God and be saved that way. If it was up to me, I wish I could say that your lifestyle and your behavior and your choices, that all that could just be okay, and that I wish I could say that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately I can't, because I don't have that luxury, because here's where it says this, here's what it says, where I find myself strangely being more tolerant or loving or accepting or welcoming than God is.
Right.
And that's a strange, like, where I feel like I'm making apologies for the God of the universe who is supposedly all love. And yet I'm, making apologies on his behalf, saying, what am I supposed to do? Like, I wish he was as loving as I was, but apparently he's not.
Yeah.
And things like that. So it's like, it gives you a chance to just reframe and rethink some of those things. And let me say this, because I can already hear, although I'm suspicious that many of your listeners are, will at least relate. I'm sure there are those who I would need to hear me say, and I want them to hear me say, that I own 100% that all those things I'm describing, all of those things could be a result of my wrong view of evangelical Christianity and my bad practice of it, or being on the wrong side of it, or the wrong brand of it, or constructing a God out of all the wrong things and making it into the one that makes the most sense to me, and then saying that's the only one. I even said, there's a song on the Fingers Crossed record that says, either you're not real or I'm not chosen, and maybe I'll never know. And either way, my heart's broken, because it's like, in other words, I don't know, like maybe this quasi-reformed, very conservative, theologically conservative God, that it was the only one that made sense to me, is just the wrong one. And maybe I need to be an atheist to that God to find a real one, if there's one to be found. I am permanently uncertain about these things. And I'm not saying that I'm right. I just know that I was wrong before. Right. And I'm probably wrong again, but at least I'm detached from my certainty about it. If anyone's saying, well, right, but you're the God you're describing, I don't believe in that God either. And I think that and you know what, you could be right. And I'm certainly not saying that all this couldn't be my fault. I'm sure that it is. But for me, it was a good thing to be able to have the opportunity to go through and really pull all those things apart. And I think the only way I was able to do that was to have to land in it and to blow right through it. Like, to land in it like a net that was supposed to catch me and find out there was air below me, I think was a great thing. Because then I was like, oh, well, good to know.
Yes.
Because if it's not real, I want to know that. And if it is real, I want to know that. And if something else is real, I want to know that. And I feel like I know a little more than I used to know in terms of maybe what's there or what's not, or at least what rings true to me.
I want to focus on the radical honesty that you mentioned. And specifically that you were mentioning, like, isn't that what we're supposed to be doing, right? To reveal our humanity to one another and to experience grace.
Truth will set you free,
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. On the podcast, we talk about secular grace. We talk about doing an honesty contest rather than intellectual debate, an honesty contest, and about trying to connect with each other. And I think you've just very eloquently described all of those things. I want to take that a step further and just say, one of the things that I admire about your deconstruction work is the radical honesty. So you did the airing of grief, and your original intention was to let people just bitch at you, right? To say, why did you do this to me, Derek? It didn't turn out that way, but you made yourself vulnerable and owned the change that you made. You understood the potential hurt that might have been there, and you put yourself out there. And I can't commend you enough for that work. Oh,
I really appreciate it. Well, yeah. So for your listeners who don't know, the Airing of Grief was a podcast that some friends and I did in the year that came right after the Fingers Crossed record. So just because I'm sure that just for people who don't know, that it could get confusing here. When I was during my years, the last 20 something years of making solo music, up until 2017 is when Fingers Crossed came out. All of my records up till then were dealing with, not exclusively, I wouldn't have called myself a Christian artist. I don't think there's any such thing. There are Christian people who make art, and their art has the fingerprints of their beliefs all over it. You can't avoid that. But I never thought of myself as a vocational minister. I was not, that's not why I was doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a professional singer and songwriter, but a lot of my work, I was always very preoccupied with spirituality and with especially looking in a critical way at the church that I did love and care about and consider myself a part of. That's
right.
That's a very brief description of kind of what my ethic was over many of those years. 2017 is where the hard pivot, the hard corner that I took, where the Fingers Crossed record was, I kind of called it the tale of two divorces. It was kind of my both horizontal and vertical divorce. I went through both in 1 year.
Right.
And that record is kind of the soundtrack for that. And so it was a bit of a record scratch moment for people who'd been with me for a long time. And because at that time there would have been a good 20 years that they might have been with me. And in all likelihood, we're in a similar place to where I was, maybe critical of, but ultimately loving and considering themselves part of the evangelical church. And so, and as I mentioned before, when I did that record, it seemed that people were using the record as a Rorschach to tell ultimately their own deconstruction stories. Because when people would try to tell me what they thought of the record, they would just wind up telling me their story,
right?
Which I really loved. And that's why my friends and I thought, okay, you know what, let's do this. Like, apparently there are not there. And again, this was back in 2015 it was 2017. Maybe there are already plenty, but for at least these people, they seem to not have a safe place to tell these stories. So they're telling them to me. And I think there are a lot of people who'd be deeply comforted to hear these stories and to hear, as you mentioned before, like their story, someone hearing their own story coming out of the mouth of another person, which means that they're not alone and they're not crazy. And so our idea was, what if we just set up essentially like a telephone number and you can just call it and I'll spend 10 minutes on the phone with you and you can just tell me your story and just tell me where you've been, and we'll bleep your name out, and we won't, it'll be semi-anonymous, and you can just kind of air your grief about your spirit, your spiritual journey or whatever. And there were some people who did use it as a means of evangelizing me, or just telling me how generally heartbroken and angry they were at me for providing soundtrack for their lives up until that point, and then departing from their story, which I understand, and that's fine. But ultimately, we did a handful of seasons of just collecting these deconstruction stories and kind of assembling them back by topic and then releasing them for people as a means of comfort and feeling welcomed and included and not alone.
Right.
And I learned more than anybody did. I mean, because I was so new to it. And so to hear the stories of some people who had been going through a deconstruction or been through already a deconversion decades before, and to hear their wisdom and what was on the other side of it, and to hear what something like reconstruction looked like for them, was really helpful. And it was, I feel like I got the best end of the deal getting to hear all those stories. But it was a pretty overwhelming response, and I'm definitely proud of that work. I'm glad it's there. We're not doing it anymore, but I'm glad it's there for people to find if they find it especially comforting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be stuck on the past here.
No, not at all.
If I were to grossly oversimplify, Fingers Crossed reads to me as, I wish I could stay in, I can't, and I'm sorry about that. Targets feels a bit more of, I'm out. What now?
Yes.
How do I reconstruct what does life look like now?
Mm-hmm.
But that leads us to your current project, which is called the Jesus Hypothesis. And I want you to talk about it, but it sounds like you're just revisiting some of the questions with a different perspective. So you want to tell us about it?
Yes. Yeah. And so that's very well said, and I appreciate it. I appreciate you checking those things out. And yeah, so Fingers Crossed I mentioned, and that's kind of the tale of two divorces. Targets was the record that came after. And that was kind of like, okay, I think I've paid my dues here now. I think I'm done grieving. I don't want that to be the hallmark of, I don't want that to be the grid through which I'm having to look at this forever. It's just, I'm always pulling a thing apart. I'm always leaving a thing. I want to go towards a thing now. Like I want to be not just repulsed, but compelled. Like I don't want to just be repelled. I want to be, And so Targets was more of a kind of defiantly joyous,
yes,
record about unbelief
yes,
and also finding love again. It's about falling in love, and I'm remarried now for several years, and so I needed some joy and the sound of joyous defiance is rock and roll, so it's a very rock and roll record.
yeah.
So Jesus Hypothesis is the new project, and the reason that I came around to doing this and what it's kind of about, or what I'm trying to accomplish, was realizing that while I did go through a pretty intense kind of audit, deconstruction, whatever process, and I like the language of audit better because it's like that feels like a thing that's meant to be done regularly, rather than there's this exhausting reconstruct it and now deconstruct it again and now build it back up and now tear it back down. It's like my solution or whatever to that potential exhaustion was to just stop constructing. Why are we constructing? Like, the term belief is so problematic to me because of all the connotation around it. Like, I don't have anything in my life I would put the weight of the term belief on anymore. I don't believe anything. Instead, rather than constructing and deconstructing, I'm going to the idea that was, and the language I like is, I'd rather hypothesize in real time, and whatever continues to ring true and work, I will continue to bring with me. But I want to be in a position to come into new information and abandon it in a second if it stops making any sense. That, I think, is a pretty decent fail-safe from what had happened before happening again. Like, I don't want to become a fundamentalist about agnosticism or atheism. I don't. I want to remain open, and I want to hear everything, and I want to weigh everything out. And so that was part of it. The other big part of it was, as I mentioned before, trying to take some responsibility and own some of my own story. And maybe that being the biggest part of why I've gone through what I've gone through, and not even really it being the fault of a particular brand of evangelicalism or God or Jesus or the church or whatever, but I want to own it. My initial trip through the China shop as the deconstructing, it was, I went in there with an axe and I chopped some stuff down, and it's what I needed to do. And I think that's the way a lot of people feel initially about it, but I was taking some pretty broad strokes. And what I realized is that as I would have conversations with my wife, with my friends, inevitably about invisible reality, about religion, about spirituality, about all of it, when I would shift into that gear and start to talk about Jesus, God, the Bible, church, whatever, fascinatingly, I would go right back to where I was in terms of how I thought, all my opinions about all that stuff. I would fall right back into it and start defending the castle again. And so my friends would joke with me and say, you say you don't have a dog in the fight, but we're in this long conversation about talking about all this stuff, and you come off like a reformed agnostic. Like, what's your deal? Like, it's like you say you're not part of it, but it's almost like you're still defending this particular view of all this stuff.
Interesting.
And I was like, oh, that's awful. Like, that means every time I go back to think about it, I'm reverting. I'm going back into previous opinions that are just don't have any up-to-date thinking around them. And it's like, so maybe the thing that I previously took an axe to, I need to go back and take a scalpel to, and I need to get specific, and I need to get focused. And what I need to do is put not just, okay, great, theism. Okay, I've put that on trial. I've already come out of that a little bit from a broad standpoint. Now I need to go in and go after Reformed theology, and I need to go after my particular things, and I need to surgically remove all of that stuff and get it detached from it, so that I can just go back and even have thoughts about God, Jesus, the Bible, the church, and have them be in any way objective in 2021, 2022, without having to only see them through the narrow view of the way I've always seen them.
Yeah.
I need to be able to look at them fresh so that I can at least have better thoughts about them and have some objectivity about them and put them in some kind of context. So that's really what this new record is. It's me going back and revisiting all of those specific presumptions and putting all that stuff up on trial, working my way through my particular view of all of it. and just hypothesizing about it and saying, okay, what if I was to allow myself, because these are not things I allowed myself previously. What if I was to, and this will sound very rudimentary to many of your listeners, but just to say it, what if I allowed myself that inerrancy does not have to be part of the fixed system? What does that now allow to happen? Mm-hmm. What if I go in with a fundamental distrust of the Apostle Paul? That's the majority of the New Testament. What does that allow to be possible now? What if I go through and, in other words, what if I change some of my rules and slowly go through and untangle all those things and then just look at all of it? Shit, there might be a lot of really interesting, insightful things to learn. And there might be some things I want to bring with me. And I don't want to give daddy all the control by being angry at daddy for the rest of my life. It's like, so I want to go in and own it. And I want to go in and look more critically at it. So that's kind of what this new record is me going through and really pulling that stuff apart.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And then you're doing one other really interesting thing, and that is that you are having your fans be a part of the process. So you'll actually do a session with your Patreon viewers, and they're able to interact with you on some level and basically get inside your head as you're building.
Yes, because I thought that the people who've been with me this long, and I have the way I kind of manage my relationship to the people who most deeply resonate with the songs and the questions and who've been with me the longest, whatever, who care that much, or we apparently have that much in common where we really deeply resonate, we're connected, is through this community platform called Patreon. And it's just a way for people to regularly micro support me, and then just have total access to everything all the time, and so everybody kind of gets what they need out of the deal. And it's a really beautiful thing. And so anyways, and that's been my thing for a handful of years now. And so my patrons, who to me feel like a safe group, because they really know me. I've spent a lot of time with most of them. It's a manageable group. It's like 400 or 500 people. It's not thousands of people. And so these are people many of whom I really legitimately know. Some of whom I talk to once a month on Zoom for about 20 minutes. It's like, and I have for years, and like, we really know each other. And I do like private online shows for them all the time. And we have Q&As and we talk, and we have Discord discussion groups. And so I felt safer offering this to them. And I've always been a very private processor creatively. And I, like nobody, my wife, my best friends don't hear the songs until I have obsessed over every conjunction. But with this, I thought, you know what? This would be, especially if I'm calling it a hypothesis, if I'm experimenting, I think it might be interesting for folks who care and who want to see that, to really go with me through the whole process and really understand literally everything about this record and the songs and the decision-making and the content and the themes. And so I started with no songs, and I said, okay, I'm going to live stream the entire process and archive it too. So you can go back and you can catch up, and then you can come with me and you can be live with me. And I've done maybe 18 or 20 songwriting live streams.
Okay.
I started with no songs. I've got about 10 songs now, but I'm not done writing. And you can go back and you can literally watch me out of thin air, like come up with and commentate my way through every melodic choice, every chord choice, every lyric choice, and just commentate my way through everything I'm thinking. I've got multiple cameras in my studio, and I just sit here and I just talk my way through it. Yeah. And I'm doing, and now that we're in the recording phase, I'm doing that with the recording as well. We got cameras running. I'm actually doing the vocal takes and performing, and we're doing it. So when the record is done, it'll come out sometime next year. I don't exactly know what the schedule is, because we're done with it yet, but you'll be able to hear the song finished and then go back and start and watch the whole song appear out of thin air over time. And it just felt like this was a good record to offer that, to pull the curtain all the way back for people who cared, and especially for people who it might benefit to hear the literal thought progression all the way through, so they could really understand every one of those lines, every one of those lyrics. And so that it would just enhance potentially their experience with the songs, to where when they're listening to it, I've been the only person who, when I'm performing songs or talking about songs or hearing some of the songs, I have the memories of, I remember where I was. I remember that moment. I remember what I was thinking about in the book I was writing when I wrote that. I remember like right when that appeared. It was so now there will be 400 or 500 other people who will have those memories with me of having been there when that happened, and they'll know exactly where I was and what I was thinking about, what I was reading. And if that helps them going through what they're going through, I thought that would be such a fascinating thing to try.
Yeah.
And so far it's been amazing. It's been really fun. It would be very overwhelming for anybody who is not a big fan. But if it is the kind of thing that you're into, I'm just happy to have the document of it. And so that's kind of the way we've been doing it. And it's been pretty interesting so far.
Well, I think you're on the cutting edge. I think that you're blazing a trail here that probably people will follow you.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. It makes the the real-time creative process of making the thing, the art just as much as the product of the result of that process, which most of the time a record, by the time somebody hears it, they've really missed all the magic. I mean, of the thing appearing and the thing happening and the inspiration and everything that goes into it and the blood, sweat, and tears. You get to hear the product of a process, but you don't get to actually observe the process. And I just think, records that have been important to me over the years, what I wouldn't give to have been a fly on the wall and have gotten to been with the artists when it was happening, and to see the moment when they sang that vocal that I have now obsessed and listened to 1,000 times and know every nuance of. And I just thought, I don't presume to be one of those types of artists, but for the handful of folks who connect with what I make in that way, I would love for them to have that. And I'm always just trying to find, especially in the world of digital art and where there's no scarcity left in the world of digital music, it's like to create something that you had to kind of be there for, and ultimately to enhance your experience of something that has no scarcity anymore. You can at least have a different experience of it and a heightened experience, an enhanced experience of it.
Yeah.
If you wish to. I liked that idea. And it feels like me making it is kind of, so for these handful of people, the experience of going through this with me is going to kind of be the art. It's that the album, so to speak, for them is going to be this whole real-time experience that we're having together.
Right.
And them honestly seeing where it's going before I do and knowing what it's about before I will, because they have the objectivity. I'm like right here. I'm like right against it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't see it. I'll be the last one to see it. It'll take me months. It always happens. Once the record comes out, months later, when I've detached from the experience of having made it and I can just kind of forget a lot of that process and just listen to it more objectively, is when I get a sense of, oh shit, like that's really revealing in a way I didn't realize deep. Yeah, I didn't realize, but I don't usually get that till later.
Yeah.
But these folks are going to know it long before me. And I also just love when art takes risks. I think that art is one of the few places left in culture where you can take real risks and you can be really, and that can make something really beautiful. And I love artists who take risks, and I'm always looking for ways to take creative risks. I think great things happen because it keeps you as a creator on the edge of your seat. It keeps you as a viewer, listener, supporter at the edge of your seat. So I love the idea of it being something that for me, after 25 years of doing this as my job, felt like risk taking. And that I immediately responded to. I had the idea of doing it this way and immediately thought, this could be awful. Like I could try it and I could literally not be able to do it.
Right.
Because I've been so private. What if I'm sitting in front of a camera and I'm seeing how many people are watching and I'm like, just can't do it? What if I just can't do it? Because you do depend on something external to kind of happen. You stand there with the key on the kite, but if the lightning doesn't strike, there's nothing worth watching. And so luckily it has worked, which I think is more a testament to the support that I receive from these people and my trust in them.
Yeah.
So anyway, but it's been fascinating. So it's been really fun. Yeah.
Very, very, very cool. On the topic of art, something that Colin was getting at, and that an obvious observation, is the bleeding of a love song in the human secular sense and a worship song to God. In some ways, you're also doing, with fingers crossed, the divorce and deconversion at the same time, the flip side of that coin. That's really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Is that something intentional?
It's a great question. The only way I know to answer it is to say that, like, I have always considered it my job and the job of an artist and this is just a definition I like, and people can use it if they like, and they don't have to, is to look at the world and describe it. Look at the world, tell us what you see. That's the job of an artist. It's really that simple. Mm-hmm. That's always been the ethic of that's always been my creative ethic, always. And it's interesting to me that sometimes when I have looked at the world to describe it, it has come out like something that would sound like a worship song. Sometimes it will come out as something that sounds critical of a worship song. Sometimes it will come out as, it comes out so many different ways, and yet it's the same process that's producing all of it. And the reason is because everything in that, the reason I like that as a job description is it's all variables. The world is constantly changing that I am observing. I am constantly changing as I observe it. So I could even stand in the same exact spot, look at the same exact thing, and describe it a completely different way, or not describe it at all, not find any particular meaning in it. So something about really adhering closely to that ethic has kept me really honest, and it's kept me, or it's presented me with the opportunity for honesty.
Right.
And so that has been fascinating to me to know, for me to know that I'm always going at it the same way. This is the same approach I always take. And yet look at what radically different things are happening over time. And I think I am really committed to that. I'm really committed to really boxing out around the creative moments. And I hope this is what my patrons are observing in these sessions or whatever, is like, I'm very committed to putting whatever perceived complication or trouble arises from something I may be writing at any given time, what may be coming out of me vulnerably at any given time, putting those, in the mail for the future for me to have to deal with, and really boxing out around the actual creative moment to make sure that at least it comes out vulnerably, honestly, so that by the time it's captured, I just don't want to have projected any kind of insecurity onto it in the moment of inception. I really work hard to make sure, even if it presents tremendous trouble for me later, I would rather say, you know what, it's not my problem right now to worry about what the consequence of me saying this is going to be.
Right.
For my friends, for my family, for my fans, for anybody. I just need to say, if this is what's coming out of me, I need to be both bodyguard and midwife to it, and really make sure it gets out, and it gets out completely, and the most concentrated, pure version of it that I can, as quickly as I can, and then just have to deal with that later. Mm-hmm. And so I just kind of always push consequences, the consequences of creative decisions, just pushing those into the future until there's nothing I can do about it. And it's like, oh, well, here's this song. And I don't know how I let myself get away with writing that. Now having my marketing business hat on, like, yeah, this is super problematic, but I can just, all I can do is go back and get mad at the artist who wrote it. But I think that's a good tension, especially as a solo artist, to create for yourself. Because there's a point at which I'm going to have to be concerned about, okay, who's this for? And how do I market it to those people? How do I try to set it up to find the people who I think it's for? And it's what I do for a living. It's how I make money. So I'm going to have to use whatever I've made back here. I've got to use that to separate people from their money, because that's how I eat.
Yeah.
So if I over alienate everybody, I'm just going to work myself right out of the job. And maybe that's, that, and I've gotten very comfortable with a cycle of self-sabotage where it's like, I feel very comfortable shedding a third of my audience annually. I think that's a pretty healthy thing, and gaining a new third of people who are more immediately resonant with what I'm making now.
Right.
I think that's probably a very natural, healthy consequence of honesty in the arts. It's like you have to you can't be mad at people who don't like what you're doing now. You have to be grateful they were ever there, and then have them clear those seats so somebody else can come sit in those seats. Yeah. But I'm happy having no more fans, just having the number generally that I have had for the handful of years that I've had them, and some of them clearing out to make room for new folks. And that's kind of the way I rationalize it and do it.
And you're growing as a human being and changing, not just from a faith position, but just as you grow as an adult.
Just in general, absolutely. That's right.
Yeah. And to be able to express those new experiences. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I have absolutely stolen. One of your guests on the Airing of Grief said something that just bowled me over. And if you know who it is, you can tell her thank you for me.
Okay.
But she disambiguated deconstruction of the church from deconstruction of God.
Yes.
And if I were to take it just one step further, I'd say there's just multiple layers of deconstructing the Bible, inerrancy, deconstructing theology, deconstructing
Absolutely.
the church. And then maybe the last thing to go is deconstructing God. And I'm just curious for you personally.
Yeah.
Did those happen in any particular order for you?
Yeah. Oh, I really appreciate you asking, because I do think that's insanely important. And I feel like what you're describing, that more granular deconstruction, is essentially what I'm doing now.
Okay.
Like I thought I was done. You did it and it happened and it's done. So now I am deconstructed. But as it turns out, everything must always get more complex. You must apply more complexity to everything all the time and break it down into smaller pieces and smaller pieces and smaller pieces. And I think that's kind of what I'm allowing myself to do now. It was big picture, now it's small picture. And yeah, that was a great feature of those conversations, especially in that first season. It's something I picked up on and probably learned from the same person who you heard it from. And then it wound up being, for me, language I brought with me into most conversations with folks who were part of our podcast. And that was it was interesting how many times somebody would tell me their story. And then as we would start to have a conversation about it, when they were kind of ready to talk about it rather than ready to tell me, once they were done kind of telling me, and we would just be discussing it. It was so interesting and ironic to me how many people I was kind of talking back into faith, because I was like, okay, that's fascinating. I hear all those parts of your story, but for me at the time, I remember quick on my feet at that time, I remember breaking it into kind of 3 categories. You're not ever deconstructing, even broad deconstruction. It's not one thing you're deconstructing. There's the idea of the church, like the institution, and the cultural voice of the church that exists kind of in the world. There's that, and your relation to that. There is the literal expression of the church, which is like Christian people, fellow practitioners of Christianity. There's that. And then there's capital God. There's the idea of the all good, all powerful maker of all things, to whom you must be reconciled by way of blah, 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 blah. So there's these 3 things. And a lot of people would really have a lot of issues with the first 2, but I wouldn't hear a lot about the last one in their story. And I was like, well, it sounds like you have basically figured out that you don't belong, you don't resonate with or identify either socially or politically with the institution of the church anymore. That's a great thing. Yeah. It's a great thing to be free of, because that just oversimplifies and reduces everything, and that's no good. And so I even if you were part of it, I would say to not be part of it anymore, because you're letting categories do all your thinking for you, and have all your conversations for you. And that's not healthy. It's not good. And then beyond that, it sounds like maybe you don't particularly identify or have been failed by or particularly hurt by the individuals, the expression, the actual community, the congregants. That's totally fair. Yeah. That's just your experience. But I don't know that necessarily has a lot to do maybe with, and maybe this is where you now get to start, as you said, thinking about how does all that bear, or does it at all, on the way you feel about God as an idea. And maybe even your understanding of God as an idea being uniquely informed by the Bible. Maybe that's a thing you need to go pull apart so that you can have a better, bigger, broader, more abstract idea of God in order to determine if that's even a thing that you agree with or resonate with. Because there's a song on the new record on G's Hypothesis that's called "Some Gods Deserve Atheists." And that's a phrase I've had for a super long time. Way before I deconverted, I had that phrase, because it was right, if I'm the likelihood that the God that any individual is believing in is mostly a construction of their own ideas is very high. Yeah. Because we are most likely, the majority of God as we see it has got to be mostly a construction of it's our own ransom letter that we've kind of compiled of a lot of crap that we've cut out of a lot of magazines. Or a lot of Bibles and a lot of experiences and a lot of relationships. We've kind of pasted this thing together. And if you're rejecting that and saying I'm an atheist or an agnostic to that, well, that's fine. And that doesn't really have anything to do with anything other than you learning how you are distinct from everything that's behind you. But it's that kind of maybe has nothing to do with whether or not there's some benevolent creative energy in the universe, and whether or not you can fit it into the skin of the God of the New and Old Testament, I mean, that's an important thing to think about, but that's not the whole conversation. And so that's the beginning of the thing, not the end of the thing, in my opinion. Because you immediately call something by a different name and loose it from all of the constraints that you've put on it. And now you're dealing with a whole other thing that needs a whole fresh, exercise of thought around it. Like, oh, well, because, like for me, the one thing that's come back around as maybe something I think I believe in, or something I think is a feature of reality that I can discern, that I think I can observe and test and does, is cause and effect. Cause and effect, I think, is an actual thing. I actually do think, and you can call that, kismet, you can call that, you could even frame that into the law of attraction, that what you put out comes back, energy that you invest returns, manifestation. All that could be boiled down to cause and effect. And I do think that's a feature of reality. I do. Beyond that, I don't know. So the point being, I think it's extremely helpful to break these things apart and not think you've done it just because you've decided you're not a part of the American evangelical church political party anymore.
Yeah.
It's like, that's a great thing to do. It's a great start. But just because I want you to be thorough and I want you to be healthy, and I ultimately want you to believe whatever rings true to you, and I don't have any problem with that, maybe don't assume that baby Jesus went out with that particular bathwater. Like, maybe you need to now start thinking about those things separate from you feeling like you're beholden to this particular political language or rigid theological worldview or whatever it is. It's like, it's important to break those things apart and to make sure that you've thought about them separately.
Right.
And that was a lot of the encouragement we tried to bring to the airing of grief conversations was like, I hear you really thoroughly doing it with this, but not with these two.
Right.
Or maybe with these two, but not with that one. So don't move faster than you're ready to move. Like, you've really thought a lot about and really have you've settled with this, but like, maybe that just frees you up to really think more critically about this other one. And don't run so fast and so far. Like, be where you are and move at your own pace. And I think that was, at least for me, helpful to say, oh, I don't have to, because some people won't go all the way there because they're like, oh, but if I do this, that means all of it's got to be, it's all or nothing and it all has to go, or I can't keep any of it. It's like, no. God doesn't get everything in the divorce. Like, there's a lot of things you could bring with you. Those could be your things. You don't lose all that stuff. You can bring love of enemy, love of neighbor. You can bring love of creation in the world. And I mean, you can bring all kinds of things with you that you thought belonged or whatever to your previously held worldview. Those can be your things. That can all be part of your own reconstruction scenario, But so so that's a great point. And I think I learned that from the folks who we were talking to in the podcast, and it was just an observation, hearing them do it. And they realized, you know what? That's not all of it, though.
Right.
You're talking about this facet and that facet, but there's at least 3, if not a dozen. But there are the big 3. There's like the group of people, the institution, and then like the dude.
Yeah.
And it's like those all deserve their own deconstructions.
Yes. And for sure, I'm doing just that, right? This idea of secular grace.
Bring that with you, of course.
I'm absolutely stealing the intuitive obviousness that former evangelicals will recognize what we're talking about.
Yep. And if there's language that's helpful and that is particularly beautiful that we do find in the pages of the Bible, well, then and if some of that poetry is helpful, and then let's bring that with us. Absolutely. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to allow some particular view of it deprive us from benefiting from it if there's benefit to be had. And so I don't want to be I want to fear no information.
Right.
I want to fear no language. There's no such thing as, like we tell our kids all the time, there's no such thing as bad words. They're not good words and bad words. There are only words and the meaning that we assign to them and the ways that we use them. And so if I particularly love certain poetic language or philosophical language in the Bible, I don't want to feel like I no longer suddenly have rights to that or something. It doesn't belong to somebody else. If I want to bring that with me and make that part of the language that I'm, again, kind of putting together to bring with me that helps me, then I have every right to do that. And so do you. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. And I'm glad to hear that that's part of the work that, the community is doing.
As we wrap up here, Derek, one of my observations is that you provide a bridge for the Christian who is in that early part of deconstruction. I've always wanted to be that, but I think my audience has turned out to be the deconverted.
Yeah.
Primarily, it's people on the other side. And how do we live and thrive now?
Yes, right.
But I really appreciate the voice that you have and how necessary it is.
Man.
And I want you to expand on one quote of yours. You have said in the past that you shouldn't fear deconstruction. The only danger is in not questioning at all.
That's exactly right.
And I'd like you to expand on that. And let's assume for a moment that maybe I have a handful of listeners who are still believers who are just beginning those questions.
Yeah, that is the quote. That because if it turns out to not be true, wouldn't you want to know? And because if it turns out to be true, don't you want to know? And so rather than to make some big decisions about languages and concepts when you're young and then just never think about it again, you just go on saying, well, that's it. I've done my thinking about that stuff. And so these are my talking points, and here's the scripture verses that back it up. And I'm kind of done thinking about that. That's not a great, healthy way to go forward and to be a person. Here's my sweet dog contributing to the conversation. Yes. She has very strong feelings about this. But yeah, so the point being that the only real danger is in not pulling the thread, because, and I've even heard, what's the language? Like that God is bigger than your doubts, or God can handle your questions and your doubts and is, arguably bigger than whatever your doubts and questions are. But so either we believe that, so what I would say is don't delay, the stakes are high. And so there's an urgency, I think, that I would like to leave people with, to really fully engaging with yourself and these conversations, to really get to the bottom of it. In other words, pull the thread and pull it. And one of the things I love about John Shelby Spong, who is one of my favorite theologians, he's an Episcopal, I think he was a bishop, and I've just gotten into his books in the last few years, and he's really tremendous. I've really loved his writing. Jesus for the Non-Religious is a fantastic book for the believer or non-believer, in my opinion, because he has such tremendous historical treatment of so much of the Bible and so much of it. I really enjoyed his work. But in the beginning of that book of Jesus for Non-Religious, in the introduction, he says, and I believe him, and he does this, that his goal is to pull the thread and follow it wherever it goes, no matter where it goes. Even if it leads him completely out of all belief and faith and all, then you have to be committed to going all the way there.
Yeah.
And so I would so pull the thread, continue pulling it, because the only danger is in not pulling it, in order to somehow keep yourself in a state of arrested development to where you don't go on to realize, because maybe there is a better, more beautiful, more believable, more intensely fulfilling version of God or whatever it is on the other side of pulling that thread just a little. Maybe you're underselling, maybe your view of and version of God, for those who are believers and fearful of losing all of it. Wouldn't you rather lose all of it if the it that you have currently is not a real thing, a thing that you have constructed that cannot save you, that cannot bring a fruitful, abundant life for you? Wouldn't you rather get past that? Wouldn't you rather be an atheist to a false God to find a real one? Don't you think that risk is worth taking? We have to be an atheist to every God that we find until we come up against a real one.
Yeah.
And so you have to continue to do that. You have to throw every false God under the bus, every false savior onto the cross, until we find ourselves to one that we have to reckon with. And that is the pursuit. That is the pursuit of all theology. That is the pursuit of all zealous believers. And so in my opinion, that the danger is in not doing it. The danger is in putting your head in the sands of certainty and saying, I will not think about it because I'm so afraid of losing it. If your mere thought of it could lose it for you, my invitation to you is that you've already lost it. If your God can't bear even the weight of the simplest tug at the thread, then it's not a real God who can save you. And so you need to be free of it. And you need to get on the pursuit towards a real God if there's one to be found, and to know God if there's none to be found. But I would rather see you pursue your way all the way into truth, or, at least feeling intellectually satisfied, than again, to just bury your head in the sand of certainty, and to be free of the preoccupation with certainty ultimately. Because when it comes, again, to invisible things like God, or unknowable things like the future, certainty, we're just not going to be trading in certainty, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's not a thing we're going to be able to be certain about. No one can claim certainty on any side of this argument. Nobody can.
We're finite human beings.
That's right. So be free of that, and then pull as hard as you can for as long as you can on that thread, and just see where it takes you. Yeah, that's always been my encouragement and my invitation, because I see, again, the only real danger is in not pulling it, because then you're just never going to know what can be known. And I personally can't live that way. I need to know what can be known.
Yeah.
And there's more to know every day. The further you pull, the more the light shines upon an even greater
new questions.
Yeah. There's even more thread to pull. And so I'll run behind that till the day I'm dead,
Wow. That is so incredible, and a great place for us to wrap up. Derek, how can people find your music? How can they become a Patreon? Let us know how they can get in touch with you.
DerekWebb.com is just probably the easiest. Is it DerekWebb? DerekWebb.com. And I'm just at Derek Webb everywhere, on social media, and wherever you go looking, that's where you'll find me. I would love for people to come and hang with our little motley crew of folks. And, we've got 30-year faithful believers. We've got people who never believed in the first place. We've got people who have come in or out of it in the last 6 months. We've got everything in between, and me never knowing where I'm at and doing it live in front of everybody. So it's like, it's a pretty warm, welcome place. I would love for folks to, if any of the music can provide any soundtrack to any part of your life, I would be honored to be found. So I think that's probably your best bet.
Awesome. Yeah. And we'll definitely have links in the show notes. So
Great.
Derek, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's great. Thank you again for answering my email. Yes. I really appreciate getting to do this. And I hope we can talk again sometime.
Absolutely. Final thoughts on the episode. I did this interview and the turnaround very quickly within 1 week, and I feel like I am still processing this conversation. There was so much to it. It is so dense. I think you can hear that I am holding back a lot, because in my mind, Derek's time was very valuable, and I wanted to get him on mic recorded as much as possible. I have a lot of thoughts. I don't think I will be able to capture them all here. I think Derek is a quote machine, and you should go back and listen to this 2 or 3 times to try to capture all of the things that he says. I appreciated the analogy of not being able to discern the quality of the boat while you're in it. This is a lot of what I talk about when I talk about being in the bubble, that you cannot gain perspective on the ideology you are within until you take at least a half step back, and that is sometimes the biggest challenge. I also really appreciated him talking about the new project, the Jesus hypothesis. In that context, he says, I would rather hypothesize in real time, and whatever continues to ring true and work, I will continue to bring with me. But I want to be in a position to come into new information and abandon it in a second if it stops making any sense. That, I think, is a pretty decent failsafe from what had happened before happening again. Ultimately, holding what we believe to be true lightly and being willing to incorporate new information is the new epistemology, the new way of thinking, the new way of discovering what is true that will lead us to closer and closer approximations of the truth. The last quote of Derek's is definitely my favorite, talking about what do you have to lose by asking the questions of deconstruction, that you either find out that it's true, which would be great, or you find out it's not true, and then you have learned something. He says, wouldn't you rather lose all of it if the it that you have currently is not a real thing? And I think that really summarizes the question at hand for all of us who have gone through some doubt, who may be in the middle of doubt. For me, this was the question. Did I care about truth, or did I care about defending my faith? And I fell on the side of caring about truth. and being willing, as Derek says, to pull on that thread for as long as it takes, as far as it goes. And in my case, it came to the end of theism. It came to the end of my Christianity. It became, for me, to atheism and humanism. If there was any daylight between Derek and I, it would be that I think he gives too much credit to the concept of the versions of Christianity. So he said early on in the conversation, it could be a result of him having the wrong view or the wrong practice. This reminds me, though, of how many times we as deconverts have been told, well, I wouldn't believe in that God either. You're believing in the wrong way. If you believed like I did, or the God that I believe in, you would have real faith and it would all be different. And so there really is no winning that battle. I think at some point it is okay to say, I'm open to new proof, to new information, but I have closed the book on the versions of Christianity or the versions of theism, and I can move on. So I think Derek gives almost too much credit to, and here I'm thinking of the Christian leaders more than the average person in the pew, because that's just, in my mind, a manipulation tactic. And I think Derek can be more assertive about where he's actually at on that particular topic. I want to thank Derek for being on the show. He absolutely lived up to the honesty contest. That seems to be the hallmark of all of his work, and I highly suggest that you check out his music, check out The Airing of Grief, become his Patreon, and discover the Jesus Hypothesis and participate in that process as well. DerekWebb.com is his website, and I will have links to all of these things in the show notes. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is about the C of the ABCs of secular spirituality, the connection part, the human connection. A quote from this episode from Derek, he says, "It turns out that I am not just a hypothetical sinner, I'm an actual one. The church loves the idea of radical confession. They love that in the hypothetical, but when you start doing it in the literal is when they start getting panicked." Now, of course, I don't believe in sin. I think you're not broken, you're human. But what I do believe in is that human connection, and you could potentially use the term confession of connecting and being vulnerable with another human being, and in a trusting, loving relationship, sharing those deepest secrets that you have as a cathartic process. I wanted to talk about secular grace so much during this conversation, but again, I didn't want to interrupt Derek much, but to say that, as Derek mentioned, we can take what we like from Christianity, and in his words, God doesn't get everything in the divorce. We can take this concept of loving one another, agape love, of sacrificial, proactive love for one another, and try to live that out in our lives without the need for a supernatural belief system. This is the bit that I am trying to bring with me and to share with you. I honestly believe this is what transforms people. Love motivates us on a level that is very, very deep. Our need for being known, being accepted, being loved is very, very deep. So if we can be that for one another, we can have a radical impact on the people around us and ultimately the community and our society. As I mentioned at the top, 2022, we've got a lot of goals, including being on other podcasts. I want to reach out to more Christian believers. We will have people like Matt Oxley, who I also think is doing a good job of being that bridge in between. We have Carlene coming up, who was on the holiday episode, and Judah coming up, who I mentioned in the Ask Me Anything. And I'm reaching out to various other slightly more well-known secular humanist thinkers, and hopefully we'll have more of those on the show as well. If you happen to know anyone you'd like to hear on the show, either a believer or humanist, please refer me to them to me, and try to get us in contact. I'd really appreciate that. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.